Lauren Fierman, Superintendent. The information that we sent out to the community concerns are the information we received from the state that PCBs have been found within the Green Mountain Union High School building. So we have this meeting scheduled so that people from the Department of Health, the Department of Environmental Conservation, and the AOE can answer questions about what that means. So I'm going to turn this over to Trish Coppolino, who's going to introduce then the rest of the panel. They're going to talk to you for a bit and then be able to answer some questions.
Hi everyone, I'm Trish Coppolino. I'm with the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. I'm here with a team of folks that are helping with the PCBs in schools work that we are required to undertake. So first and foremost, thank you for taking time out of a busy schedule. I'm a parent also. My kids are really busy, and so I appreciate you coming here to hear what we have to say and hopefully answer some questions that you might have. And I'm sorry that we're here to talk to you about PCBs in your school. It's certainly not something that we want to choose to talk about.
So I'm the program manager for our Contaminated Sites program within the Waste Management and Prevention Division, and I am here with my state partners who I will let them introduce themselves.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Sarah Owen. I'm the state toxicologist at the Health Department in Vermont.
Hi, I'm Danielle Allen. I am the PCB coordinator at the Health Department.
Jill Briggs-Campbell, Agency of Education.
Hi, Cassie Kimmy, and I'm the project manager under Trish for this district.
Hi, Evan Pendleton, PCB coordinator for the Department of Environmental Conservation.
So before I start, I just want to make sure you understand all of our different roles and why we are a multi-state group here. So within the Department of Environmental Conservation, we have the regulatory responsibilities for looking for PCBs and then working towards how to clean up the PCBs in schools and in other places across the state. The Health Department supports us by looking at concentrations and providing us with a standard for us to use to clean up to make sure that we're creating healthy environments inside and outside of the state. And then the Agency of Education has been given authority to fund the work that we're doing. And so Agency of Education funds work that's approved by the Department of Environmental Conservation related to PCBs in schools. So if you're asking questions and we pass the microphone around, you'll understand why we are doing that. Each of us has a different role on this team. All right, so let's start briefly with what PCBs are. So they're polychlorinated biphenyls. They are a man-made chemical. They were made by Monsanto for use in multiple different uses in multiple different ways, but specifically in buildings, they were used as a way to keep some materials plastic or malleable. And so think about any material in a building that you would want to stay soft, like caulking around a window, jointing materials, paint, mastic, glues. Those are the things that Monsanto added PCBs into to try and prolong the life of those materials. So that's why we're looking at schools specifically, because there are, they have been used in building materials in schools. PCBs were banned by the EPA in 1979 due to their bioaccumulative properties in the environment due to their toxicity, and because they don't break down easily, so they are in the environment for a really long time. The Vermont legislature required the state to look at all schools that were built or renovated before 1980 to determine whether or not there are impacts from PCBs to indoor air. This was promulgated based on findings of high concentrations of PCBs in Burlington High School. PCBs can have multiple different types of health effects. There's cancer and non-cancer endpoints from exposure to PCBs. On the cancer side, breast, liver, and melanoma. And on the non-cancer side, there's immune, reproductive, nervous, and endocrine cancer or non-cancer endpoints. Based on this information, the health department provided the Department of Environmental Conservation with 2 values for us to use when we're evaluating impacts to schools. The first one, which is on the bottom, which is the school action level, this concentration indicates when there's an impact to indoor air, where there's a source that needs to be investigated and removed. The concentration of 100 nanograms per meter cubed is set for 7 through adult, and that's the concentration we're looking at this school to determine whether or not a release has happened and if additional work needs to occur and concentrations in indoor air need to be reduced. The concentration for the immediate action level is set for us to determine when a space should have an immediate action taken where there's concentrations that need to be addressed right away. The process that this team put together to look at schools throughout the state is basically the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation hires an environmental consultant to go to each individual school. And when they go to each school, they do an inventory of every single space in that school. Hallways, bathrooms, classrooms, auditoriums, gymnasiums. They go into each space and they will document every single building material that's in that space that they can see that could potentially have PCBs in it. Based on the inventory they do, we've asked them to put them into groups. So they'll go through all of the inventory work that they did, and they'll take all of the spaces and put them into like groups. And so when we get a work plan from the consultant, we could have up to 10 different groups where they've put all the different spaces based on construction, based on types of materials that they see, based on the heating systems that are in there, based on renovation or construction, and they'll put them into groups for us. And then we've asked them to sample 30% of the spaces in each group. And so if there are 30 rooms in a group, they would sample 10 of those rooms. We would take that information and we would carry it across that entire group and basically say the concentrations that were detected in these sampled spaces are representative of all the spaces that are in this specific group. The hope and point of all of this is that we can have good information about large schools, lots of spaces, and be able to make decisions that are protective of the students and staff that we want to make sure they can stay in school and continue learning. This is a picture of what one of the samplers looks like. I thought you might like to see what it looks like. So this part down here, this is what the sampler is, and it's a pump. It pulls air through this media right here. And so this is really a glass tube that has a polyurethane foam filter inside of it. And so the pump runs for 24 hours and it pulls air through that filter. The PCBs will adhere to the filter, and then we send that off to the lab to analyze for PCBs in indoor air. I should point out that PCBs are a large group of chemicals. There's 209 different types of PCBs that we call congeners. When we send the samples off to the lab, we're actually looking for a specific trade name that's called Aerochlor, and that's what Monsanto named them. They're a mix of all those congeners that they put together for certain uses, and so we're looking at Aerochlor results. We take the Aerochlor results from the lab, we total them, and that's the number we use when we look at an impact or a concentration that we see in a space. So I wanted to go over some of the detections that we saw in the school. This would have been in the community letter that the school sent to you, but I'll go over them. So on the first floor of the school, the range and concentration was 320 to 4 nanograms per cubic meter. There were a total of 15 spaces sampled, and the average concentration detected was 148 nanograms per meter cubed. On the second floor, the range in concentrations was 280 to 77 nanograms per meter cubed. The number of spaces sampled were 17, and the average concentration detected was 143 nanograms per meter cubed. And on the third floor, the range was 600 to 170 nanograms per meter cubed. The number of spaces sampled was 13, and the average concentration detected was 323 nanograms per meter cubed. This is really just for you to see how the consultant grouped the school. So the colors here aren't representative of concentration or anything like that. It's really how each space was grouped together. So these light blue spaces were all grouped together in one group. Similarly, these were all grouped together. This is a hallway, so that was all one group, just so you can see what the grouping looked like here. So that's the first floor. That's the second floor. And that's the third floor. So a lot of classrooms grouped together, hallways are separate. When we shared the results with the school, the next thing is for us to talk about what the next steps look like, both from a regulatory standpoint, but also making sure that we can keep the school and the students and staff in a healthy space. So right now, I think, a positive outcome is that school's out in about 10 days, and so the ability to keep school operating as is certainly supported and okay. And so right now, that's what we're doing. We're going to end the school year, and then we're going to work towards identifying sources of PCBs and looking at ways to try and clean up the PCBs. So during the summer, the school has already hired a consultant to start that work plan, which will basically be sent to DEC showing what building materials will be sampled, how many of them will be sampled, and a time frame for that to happen to come back to us. Starting for the next school year, we'll certainly be working through the summer to have an understanding of what the fall program looks like for this school, so that we can help the school support use of different spaces in the school and making sure that it's a healthy environment for students and staff to be here. The only other thing to add on top of this is that we're also working with the University of Iowa, who has a super fun research program where they completely focus on PCBs in schools. That is their primary mission at this location in Iowa. And they'll also be coming out here at the end of June to do some sampling. And the sampling they do is similar. They use a similar material that we had for the sampler. So they use a foam, polyurethane foam sampler. They would attach it to different places in the school that are potentially PCB containing building materials. And the results that they give us are emissions specifically from those building materials to help us identify the ones that might be causing the highest emissions into the indoor air of the school. That is the informational part of this presentation. I'm sure you have questions, and we really want to hear what they are so we can try and answer them for you. I think there's a microphone set up here if you want to ask questions.
Hello. Hi, my name's Randy. One of the questions I have is you don't test the whole school, you just do portions of it. So how do you know where you're going to move the kids is going to be safer than maybe some of the areas? Do you test those rooms before they go in it, or do you come back and test different rooms? How does that work?
So right now, the way we do the sampling is we use the grouping a lot. And so based on the samples that were taken from that group, we'll take the highest concentration from those spaces and we will apply it to all of the unsampled rooms. When we do work over the summer, and we do any type of work to remove PCBs or cover them up so they can't keep emitting, we will go back in and resample those spaces to make sure that we've reduced concentrations. So we can't sample every room in a school. So we basically are extrapolating those concentrations into unsampled spaces using the highest concentration.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do we need to go to the mic? We have to. Dwayne English, how you doing? Thank you. So I'm familiar with PCBs through oil, like from electric company and all that good stuff, and of course mold remediation and all that. So, curious, you said 24 hours they set. Did you guys shut the school for a couple of days before that? Was it on a Saturday, Sunday? I'm just curious, or was it like literally the middle of the week?
So
Was there kids here? I'm just
that answer I don't know, but we have asked schools to make sure that their air handling systems are operating the way they would be normally when school is in session.
So you didn't put the tests in? Who installed them?
Correct. So we hire environmental consultants to do that work for us.
Okay.
So they came to the school and they put the samplers in. Each school is different. Sometimes they sample overnight into the next day. Sometimes it's over a weekend or a school break.
And then my other question would be, did you guys do any outside air tests?
We did, yep, and they were fine.
They were fine?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And you keep saying we. Are you guys, is you as representing the state of Vermont coming to do this mediation, or you say we like we're going to hire contractors and we're paying?
That one, we're hiring contractors to do the work. So
Okay.
we're regulatory.
Are we paying you? That's what I guess I'm curious.
There's funding set aside, state money, to pay for the consultants to do that work.
Okay. All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Just to clarify, were you also asking about who's paying for the remediation?
No, she just kept saying we as like coming back into the test, so I'm just curious.
Okay.
Are we paying you every time you come in and test? And just curious, or is the test part of the state funding?
Yeah. So the initial indoor air quality testing is, yeah, it's all paid by the state.
I would like to know too, if you could bring up about what, I don't think I saw in the email what the test on the outside, was there any reading or any?
It was non-detect below the state, the lab detection limit.
So I have several questions. The first one is who pays for remediation? I understand from the website it's the community is responsible for paying for that remediation. Can you give me is there any sources of funds to help with that?
So the answer to that is in flux right now, but I'll pass it down to Jill, and it's in flux because of the legislature.
So, excellent question and understandable. Where we're at with this right now, and I sort of half jokingly say as of June 7th at 5 p.m., this is our understanding of the funding situation. Originally, in the last legislative session, $32 million of education funding was set aside for PCB remediation. Of that, $2.5 million was available through the AOE. We were authorized to reimburse school districts for the costs associated very specifically for the cost of hiring a consultant, source investigation, and what we call mitigation measures. So those interim steps that are trying to lower the levels of PCBs, but not the permanent removal. So that's what we call remediation. There was a requirement that the legislature act on the remaining $29.5 million in this session. That happened at the very end of the session, and it's in the appropriations bill, which you may or may not be aware of, the governor has vetoed. So that's why we're saying it's in flux. We actually don't know. As it's written, of the $29.5 million, up to $16 million has been set aside for Burlington High School for their remediation costs. That leaves $13.5 million available. Of that, the appropriations bill directs the Agency of Education to reimburse school districts for 100% of the costs that you will incur around source investigation, mitigation, and permanent remediation. So that's as currently drafted. Until that bill is signed into law, that's about as certain as we can be. So I hope that answers your funding question if you have follow-up, but that's sort of the current status right now.
Do you want to talk to that? We have our two reps here, so.
I was going to say, I see some familiar faces.
I think they would like to talk to you about that, but before I turn this over to them, I did have another question. Obviously, when Burlington came in with their 15, and I'm not going to include all the following of after that, the Vermont Department of Health lowered it to 100, and the EPA, we know, is between 500 and 600 for 7th through adult, and for teachers down to 300. Is there a possibility now in just, it is kind of startling to see that they are going through a whole new building for 15 when this particular school has an average of over 100. And in one area on the 3rd floor, it's above 300, which is the immediate action step you have. Is there a possibility that now VDH is going to come in and say, oh, we're going to lower it again, and it could be more in line with the EPA?
I can talk about the levels, and then maybe Trish, if you want to talk more about Burlington specifically. So when Burlington found PCBs, that was in 2020, and at that point we had what we call a screening level. And a screening level is what we start with anytime we have a chemical in air or water or soil. And screening levels follow a really quantitative or prescriptive formula for any chemical, any media. We always use the same formulas. And that's what gave us our 15 nanogram per meter cubed. If you look at EPA's process, they also have a screening level for PCBs. They would use a screening level of 5. For PCBs in schools. So on that metric, we're really close to EPA for a screening. Of course, Burlington was before we had this framework, and Trish mentioned the grouping. We realized during Burlington that we really were uncertain about any of those untested rooms, and we were really unable to give Burlington any advice on those untested rooms, especially considering that the highest levels that were at the Burlington school were over 6,000 nanogram per meter cubed. So as part of the development of this framework, the Vermont DEC identified what a background level of PCBs would be. And we recognized the need to develop action levels that were reflective or that schools could use to prioritize when sources were there that could be removed. And so that's how we arrived at our action levels. So it's not that we didn't change a level. So the 15 nanogram per meter cubed is still a screening level. That's a purely health-based level. What we did is we took that to the next step of risk management. So we wanted to make levels that schools would be able to take action on instead of looking for sources that may be really hard to find. So you're right that our action levels are a little bit lower than EPA's. There's a few differences in that. We assume that students are in the classroom. We call it the reasonable maximum exposure. So for example, we assume 9.75 hours a day for students and staff in school. EPA uses average estimates for people in school, which is about 6 hours. So I know that my kids are in after-school programs several times a week. And the way that we do risk assessment for all our chemicals and all our medias, we always look for protection of those people who are in the school the longest or drinking the most water. Do you want to say anything about Burlington and maybe extent of contamination or anything, or leave that?
I think the thing that I'm hearing is that when you look at this at face value and you see this number of 15 for Burlington, and then you were looking at these numbers here for the 3 areas, the 3 groupings you have, all of which are above the accepted state level, because it's like 130, 148, 303, whatever. That's going to raise a lot of concerns since Burlington has taken down their school literally and are building a new one. So what kind of reassurances are parents going to have that even though our levels are higher, we may need to take a different path, or just what? I don't know how we get around that one.
Understood. So the levels here are lower than Burlington. So Burlington was 6,000 in indoor air, and the levels here, I think the highest was 500. 600, thank you. So the levels here are lower than Burlington.
Okay.
The difference between Burlington and now, I'm not going to say this specific school, is that when Burlington came through the program, they came in with 2 or 3 air samples for us to look at, and we did not know how those results could actually be carried across an entire school that's really large. And so I think they came in the day before school was supposed to start with Burlington, and so the next day the school decided that they were going to go remote. The amount of work that Burlington needed to do to get more air samples and then be able to carry it across the entire school took a little while. And I think along that path, the high school and the school district there decided that they wanted to still move forward with renovation/new school. So it was kind of a path that they had already selected in their decision making. So I think it is a lot different than where we are here, where we have a much better understanding of a school-wide concentration and can make decisions to help the school continue to use the spaces here versus where we were with Burlington.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'm State Senator Dick McCormick, and Windsor County has 3. I bring greetings from Allison Clarkson and Becca White, and I'll be giving them a report after this meeting when we divvy up the work, and there are other meetings in the county this evening. The legislature sets policy. The administrative branch, the executive branch, carries the policy out. You people are the experts. And I have actually come tonight to learn much more than to instruct or to give information. I will say to the people here that your legislative delegation, both in the House and in the Senate, is aware of the problem and alarmed about the fiscal implications and so on. We will look to the experts for guidance, and we will also be looking for money, which we often have to do. That's a big part of our job. I do want to say that I'm sure that we all agree that ultimately the health of our children is the priority. We do have to try very hard to not impose an intolerable financial burden on a community, which is why I say we'll be looking for money. The situation right now is that we passed a budget that includes money for PCB remediation and research. The governor has vetoed the budget. I don't think because of that provision. But he has vetoed the budget. We meet in a veto session, the 20th, 21st, and 22nd, or if I'm off, it's by a day or two. And we may or may not override the governor's veto. It will be close. If we override, and I think most people expect that we will, but it's not a guarantee. If we override, then we have the budget and that money is there. If we don't, we have to get a budget together that the governor will accept. And certainly, whatever we put together will have money for PCBs. I'm guessing more. That's not a promise because I can't speak for all 180 colleagues, but my sense is that there will be money for PCBs. So at this point, I'm going to have to ask people to bear with the discomfort of uncertainty. But I can say that we're not going to drop the issue. I can say that with certainty. And I think you have more to do so. We're going to hang around, and if people want to ask us questions, we'll be available.
State Representative John Arison. My district includes Cavendish and Baltimore. And while the panel's here, I hope people don't mind, I'd like to steer a little bit away from this building in particular and ask you some specific questions on the program in general. Vermont was the first state in the country to take on a program like this. Right or wrong, we're in the middle of it. Could you elaborate more on the specific health risks of PCBs and where the information came from? Another part to my question is, the last time I saw the list of schools that had been tested, we were at North Country in Newport. How much farther down the line are we? I know the list was composed with the higher risk schools. This building's 51 years old, I think, something like that. And everything built after 1980 was going to be way down the list appropriately. How far along are we in the list? Those are my two questions.
All right, so everything built before 1980 needs to be sampled. There are, and I have this in front of me because I thought someone might ask me the question. So there are a total of 321 schools that need sampling in the state of Vermont. The way I report this out is based on how we're processing things within the DEC. And so when we talk about inventories, there are 118 schools that have already been approved or have their inventories happening. And then there are 76 schools that have their indoor air sampling plan into us that's been approved or has happened. So we're 24% into the sampling piece of getting the school sampled, so a quarter of the way maybe. And then from there, just to continue through, there's 16 schools that have concentrations that are above that school action level, and it could be from pre-K all the way up to 7th grade, so I didn't distinguish between those. There are 7 schools that have an immediate action level exceedance, and then there are 41 schools that have come in that have nothing above the school action level. So we're trying to make as much progress as we can, but we're about a quarter of the way through the schools right now.
If I could, and this may be a little bit more of interest to the residents, I know Cavendish was tested and it came out clean. Surprised me, but I'm certainly glad to hear that. Has the elementary school been tested here in Chester? It has? Not yet, no.
Sorry, I will finish the answer the first part. We're certainly encouraged by around that 70% of schools that don't have exceedances. Those are good to see. So you had a question about the scientific information that we use. So all the risk assessment work that we do at the health department is based on the science that's published by what we call authoritative government bodies. So these are very large scientific organizations like the US EPA or the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And these authoritative government bodies make decisions about the toxicity of chemicals and tell us how potent chemicals are. So we do use that published information. Those government bodies tell us that PCBs do cause cancer in humans. They also tell us that PCBs can cause some serious health effects, including effects on our immune system, our reproductive, and our endocrine and nervous systems. if you look at the list of chemicals that EPA, under their toxic program, the list of chemicals they've taken action on, there's about 6 chemicals in that group, and PCBs are one of those. So unfortunately, PCBs are very toxic chemicals that sort of rise to the top of the list when you're thinking about environmental chemicals that we know are bad and that we want to reduce exposures to. Does that answer your question about the science?
Yes.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Heather Chase, and I'm the rep that represents Chester, and I just want to look to you all. I spoke with the chair of the Education Committee today. I've spoken with people at AOE, the Agency on Education, excuse me, and I just want you to know that I'm going to be talking to the superintendent, the school board members, keeping you updated. I'll be involved. Hopefully the budget is going to pass. It's the commitment of the administration and the House that there is funding available for this, but I just wanted to say that I'm glad to see you here. I think it's something that we're going to have to keep abreast of for a long time, because this summer will be a large assessment time, but then there's going to be quite a long time, right? You guys can, I'll ask that question to them. Oops. But it's going to be quite a long time until this, you investigate it, you go through the mitigation, remediation, and then abatement. So just to keep in mind, I don't know if there's a quick fix for all of this, but let's hang in there together and work through this. Am I right on that? Yeah. And how long is the process to abatement typically?
That's a wild card question. It really depends on what we find as the sources of PCBs. It could be as simple as maybe some capacitors that we can remove to reduce concentrations, to having, impacted paint or something that we need to take care of. So it really depends on the sources that we identify over the summer.
Okay. And during the summer, how often will you be getting back to the public about where we're at in that process and what we can anticipate going down the road?
That's another good question. The current process as laid out in best and worst case scenarios really looks like the consultant potentially being able to be out here in a couple of weeks to start sampling. So they need to put together a work plan that they'll send to Cassie, and Cassie's going to review it and approve it, and then I'll bless it, and it'll allow for the consultant to come out here. They're going to do work, probably takes up to a week or two based on the size of the school and the number of samples they need to collect, and then send the samples off to a lab for them to analyze it. And that is like the biggest wild card for us, because we can't control how quickly something comes back from a lab. It can be 2 to 6 weeks before we get results back. And they could be phased. They could send results or samples in batches, and we could get results back in batches. So from start to getting results, we're talking up to 2 months. So we're really thinking the end of July, beginning of August, before we'll have a good idea on what the sources are. I think Lauren had suggested sometime in the second week of August, the school will be back in touch with the community to talk about what September looks like. And by then we should have some better answers to share with everybody. In the interim, thought process is, while we're looking for sources, there are some effective ways to reduce indoor air concentrations in classrooms that we've used in other schools, really using carbon filtration units where the PCBs have an affinity to the activated carbon in the unit, and we've seen great reductions in indoor air concentration. So while we're looking for the sources, that is another way for us to reduce concentrations if and when we can't actually remove something before school starts.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
We'll certainly share back out as soon as we have any additional information that comes to me, to Todd. Everybody will get it. Great.
So are the levels that you're finding, have they been here from day one? Or is it something that has kind of filtered down and grown throughout the years? And I know including myself, there's a pretty good quantity of people that not only attended high school here, but have been working in the building for an additional 20 some odd years. So how is that affecting our health?
Understood. I'll answer what I can about how long the PCBs have been in the indoor air, and I'll let Dr. Owen answer the questions about impacts to health. So there are not a lot of studies of PCBs that were put into a building and then sampled over years to see what the concentrations are. It's not something that any regulatory body has done. It's certainly not something that Monsanto was doing either. And so the assumptions are when the materials were put in the school, that's when the concentrations were the highest, right? That's when they were just mixed, they're fresh, they're put here. Over time, they off-gas and they decrease in concentration in the material that they were put in. So concentrations in the material that they're in and in indoor air are expected to decrease over time because the concentrations are starting to degrade within that material. But I can't tell you what the concentration was in 1970 when the building was built versus what it is today. We only have one data point, and that was from April. So that's the best I can share about concentrations, which isn't a great answer, but it's the only one I can give you right now.
And in terms of health effects and how people could be affected, we do know a lot about health effects from studies on animals, which is really common in the world to learn about health effects based on studies in animals. We also know about effects on humans based on people who were working with PCBs in really high concentrations. And so that's where we get the information about PCBs are unfortunately able to increase a person's risk of cancer and increase our risk of other health effects. But we can't use that information to predict what kind of health effects an individual might experience. So we advise people to talk to your healthcare provider as you go in for your regular appointments. There's some information on our website that you can bring with you, and you can email us if you'd like some more information. But it's good to have that conversation with your healthcare provider, because a lot of these health outcomes are things that can be discussed with your provider, and they know your medical history, and they are things that they can keep in mind as they work with you over the years.
Hi. We have been hearing a lot about PCB levels for 7th grade and up. There have been times in the history of this building where we've had younger children in the building, and I wonder, are there any considerations or thoughts that need to be put towards that? I also know Chester Andover hasn't been tested yet. Does that maybe potentially warrant expediting air quality assessment at Chester Andover? I know there's a lot of construction happening this year, but I don't know if that's something.
And my understanding is that a lot of it has to do with when the buildings were built. So it's not so much on whether it's what town it is in. Right? So we have 4 elementary schools in the SU. 3 out of the 4 have been tested and don't have issues. Chester Andover is the last one to be tested.
Just a quick note, you are right that the younger kids have lower levels at which we become concerned, because we do take into account how much people are exposed to in the diet. Little kids have more exposure from the diet. How that comes into play here, I will let Trish talk about.
Thanks.
Oh. I mean, we haven't done any work here to look at pre-K or K through 6, but, overall, if you just have, younger kids coming in for a short amount of time, picking up other siblings or coming here for some of the plays, they're not likely to be exposed to very high, or they're not likely to accumulate a lot of PCBs in their bodies from those short-term exposures. But, if this school were to be repurposed for a pre-K or a K through 6 program, then I think we as the state would have to work with the school, and they would be held to a different level. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, but there have been times when this
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, I think Tricia said we really can't guess what the levels would have been back then. So we're just going forward with what we know now and how the school is used now.
And Lauren's right. So the way the way we looked at the schools is we prioritized based on age of the school construction. So from, I think we looked at, and Danielle can correct me, but I think it was 1965 to 1980 as the highest potential time frame for PCBs to be put into building materials. And so those schools that were built in that time frame were rated the highest. And then ones that were built earlier were second and third and fourth. And then we looked at the type of school, so what age population was there, and we looked at free and reduced lunch populations, and that's how, you know, we built the schedule for school sampling. Thank you, Danielle. 1950 to 1980.
I have another couple quick questions. One, I don't know if you can answer this, Lauren, or not, but do we have carbon filters in place now, or are we just, no?
We do not. It's one of the things that we're in current conversation about making sure that we're bringing in. And those are things that we would be able to have assistance with paying for. So we've had conversations about it by we and Todd, along with this group of people, about bringing them into all of our regions.
Okay, that's good. That's good.
The filters we have at the moment, we brought in for COVID, they're different kind of filter.
Yep.
They're useful in their own right, but not for this particular purpose.
Yeah, I was just curious. If we had carbon, the readings would probably be much higher if those probably weren't in place. So that's a good thing that we're not there yet, and that will hopefully reduce it down. My second thing I was going to ask, and it was already asked, is you're only about 25% through everything, and you've got 7 schools already cropping up that have that. I think we're going to need a lot of money.
Laughing, but it's not funny.
It's not funny. We're going to need a lot of money.
That's our job.
I'm afraid I don't know. I don't know when Chester Andover is.
I didn't hear the question.
When was Chester Andover built?
1950, early 50s. I don't know the exact date. I'd have to look it up.
We might be able to have it for you by the end of the meeting. Danielle's looking to see if we can access it.
And all of our schools are essentially, we're scheduled for testing within this first year plus of testing. So, and while we haven't done Chester Andover yet, it is on the schedule, and again, I don't remember exactly when, but sometime within the next, I think the next 6 months or so, because it's one of the earlier ones to be done.
And I wish we could forecast how to know which school would have PCBs in it, but we have not figured that piece out yet. We've certainly had schools within districts where one is high and one is low, or one is high and 3 are low. So we have not figured that piece out yet. I hope we can one day, but we have not gotten there.
Well, it does seem that it's about what the materials are that were used, based in part on time, but also on who the contractor was and what they decided to do, which is why I know I've heard that it happens in regions, but it's not because of something special for the region. It's about the time frame and the materials that are used. You might have more of that in a region because you use the same contractors, not because there's something good or bad about a particular town. Is that a reasonable?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
1956.
Thank you, Scott.
Hi, Kelly Spalding. Question, is there data at the state level that shows any clusters of disease or outbreaks? I mean, thinking with Burlington being as much as it being first, is there any stuff that shows there that's?
Yeah, no. So studies, so those would be epidemiology studies, and it does take a lot of time for some of these health effects to happen. So, cancer, we know that there's a a latency period, so a time between when you're exposed and a time when cancer develops. And so studies like that would have to be done by researchers who would have to, write grants and get money, and they would have to follow hundreds or thousands of people. So in a town, in a population as small as Burlington, it would be really hard to get data like that.
Is there anything looking forward statewide with putting money into that type of stuff?
Not that I'm aware of. So the health department doesn't do research. There may be other academics who are looking into that, but it's not something that I'm aware of at the health department.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So just going back to the younger students being here, because I believe there was a preschool downstairs for probably more time than not up until 6 years ago, 5 years ago. So I've got 5 children that attended 3 years of preschool here, and then up through one which has had major health issues, and a couple of other that I know were here during that preschool time that have had similar type of health issues. How long would pre-K, specifically 3 to 5, have to be exposed to something? Like, would that typical preschool day elevate that risk to the point that they would be having health risk at this point, 18 years later?
Yeah, so when we think about the health effects, we do divide the cancer and the non-cancer health effects because they're different types of equations. So the cancer risk for kids who would be here for 3, 4, 5, 6 years is overall very low. When we think about the cancer risk, that mostly applies to staff who are here for 30 years. The other health impacts are things that, well, I guess I should back up and say just because a room is over an action level, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to get health effects. The way that all of the risk assessment world works is that the big scientific community, so that the EPA, the authoritative bodies that set the toxicity of chemicals, they look at the dose of chemical that is without health effects. So they look at studies and they see the animals get sick at these effects, and then they look to find that level that no animals get sick at. And that's what they translate into the levels that health departments across the country use. So our goal is to keep people underneath that level so that we can say, we're really confident that this is a healthy environment. But it doesn't mean that just because you're over, that health effects will truly, some people may develop health effects and some people may not. It is a really difficult question to answer. Typically, we think about the non-cancer, when we do our exposures, the non-cancer health effects, that's a 1-year exposure duration. I can also follow up with you if you want to talk more about some of the specific research and what's been shown, and maybe some of that would be good to bring to the pediatrician or to help you with some of those conversations as well. Okay. Yeah.
Are there more questions?
We're happy to also disperse, and you can come and talk to us individually if that's something that is more comfortable for you also. So
I think that might be quite useful.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to say, but while we have a pause anyway, that you're listening to this group of very well-informed people who can give us a great deal of information, and also lots of things that they can't answer questions about. We're at the very beginning of a very long process, and we're going to be in touch constantly with people acting from the state, with our state representatives. I've had contact with other state representatives as well as other state officials around this. People are aware that we're going through this. They're going to be available to help us within the range of abilities that they have. They said we're at the very beginning of a very long process. I am very hopeful that we have already have some suggestions in place that will allow us to reduce some of these levels, and that we have, even under a worst-case scenario, because the school is so much larger than our student population, the ability to continue to run school in classrooms that are below that action level, so that we're going to be able to do this in a safe way as possible and make sure that everybody's needs are being met. We've got a lot of good people working on it. We'll continue to communicate. Any information we have will go out to everybody. And if you're available to continue to talk to people, if you want to ask additional questions, I'm sure that would.
And our email address is up here. If you think of questions later and you want to ask us, feel free to just pop us a question. We'll be happy to respond to you as best we can. Thank you for your time.
One real quick, actually. My name's Josh. It's probably a moot point at this point. And so, I guess, but I don't know if I could sleep that well if I didn't ask it, just because I'd just be curious. We recently went out to bond for an extensive renovation in this school and other schools, local schools. And it didn't pass. It was close, but didn't pass. And I guess I'm curious to see if the bond was going to address certain things like asbestos and caulking and tiles and ceiling tiles and whatnot. But I don't know, would that, had the bond passed, would that have changed kind of where we are now in terms of going forward with any sort of remediation? Like, would that, because this information obviously just came to us, the bond would have passed. Do you know, with your experience, if anything would have kind of come together and we could have remediated for the PCBs as well as all the other stuff that we were working on? Okay, short answer, great. Yeah.
So what we've done with other schools where they are looking to do a large renovation of the school, we try to work with the school and their plans for renovation as well as being informed of what the PCB concentrations might be in building materials, so that that can all happen at the same time, so that when the school is renovated, you have a clean school and the renovation has happened with whatever you were planning to do. So certainly new HVAC is a great way to try and reduce indoor air concentrations in schools. Bringing in fresh air is great. Doing any other work where you're removing other materials that could have PCBs in it as part of your renovation is certainly something that we would be looking for anyway as part of a way to clean up a school. So it could have been something that happened in parallel.
Thanks for that. It was partly Mr. English's question on the outside air, that there was no concentration there. So good to know going forward. So thanks a lot.
So you can also get it by touching it if it's leaping through or something, if you touch the pen that contains it, or is it just an air thing that's being absorbed?
So PCBs migrate multiple different ways in building materials. So there's the volatility piece where the PCB itself can become volatile. And so there's that piece of it. Then there is the dust piece. So dust can land on the PCBs. The dust can become impregnated with PCBs, and then that can migrate. So you can inhale or ingest PCBs that way. That's usually a much smaller concentration. And then there's the touch and eat kind of ways for transport to happen. Those are the three major pathways for exposure to PCBs.
So I guess in some ways it's probably good the bond didn't go through, because now actually you might be able to pinpoint more where it's coming from and target it better once we identify the exact areas and problems.
I honestly don't know what your bond was for, but my experience with other places where we're doing large renovations is to understand what the sources are and build that into the work that you're doing so that it's taken care of while the renovation is happening.
It wasn't a bond, I misspoke. It's renovation and a chunk of money we're going to have to pay, but I was afraid that if we got into that, we wouldn't know exactly where the sources were coming from. Okay.
Thank you for your time. We'll move around if you want to talk to us, or you can email us. I appreciate everyone coming tonight.